Well, hello plant lovers. I'm being spiked by these leaves. It is Matthew in Melbourne. Thank you very much for finding me. I grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids in Melbourne, Australia, without any help from grow lights, greenhouses, humidifiers, etc., etc. Just me and them indoors or outdoors or not at all. And I found it quite hard to find information about how I could grow orchids here in Melbourne, and so I started a channel. If it is of any interest to you, do hit subscribe. I post every week and you can follow my very amateur ramblings. And this week, plant lovers, ta-da, 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 perhaps not the flashiest of plants, but I wanted to continue a little bit of a Cymbidium theme that I'm going on and talk about species Cymbidiums. So I think we're all familiar with the Cymbidiums of common horticulture, the hybridized ones, the either upright Cymbidiums that are very easily found in hardware stores and nurseries around the world, or they're slightly less easier to find but nonetheless has beautiful pendant hybrid Cymbidiums, which in Australia anyway are a little harder to come across and you don't see them that often. You have to go to more specialist growers. But they, of course, all came from somewhere, and they came from species ancestors. Now, a lot of those Cymbidiums that you see hybridized, in fact, most of them, came from species orchids that grow in that sort of Himalayan high-altitude region, stretching from India to Nepal to Bhutan, all the way across the Himalayas, southern China, northern Vietnam, northern Laos, northern Myanmar, all the way across there. Now, Cymbidium species do stretch all the way across to Australia and the Pacific, but the ones that grow really well for me are the ones from those high altitude, more Himalayan areas. But if you're in the tropics, lucky you, first of all, because it's late winter here in Melbourne and I've had enough. There are lots of, well, not lots, but there are tropical Cymbidiums, and the Australian native Cymbidiums are from the far north of the country, and they are tropical, so they need the heat and the humidity and that sort of monsoonal weather pattern. But the species Cymbidiums that I can grow are the ones that are a little more attuned to my environment, and I tend to be able to grow a lot of mountain orchids and high altitude orchids, and most of the orchids that grow in the Himalayas I can grow quite well in Melbourne. So that also includes Paphiopedilum species from that part of the world. Well, all manner of things. There are lots of amazing orchids that grow from there. So this week I thought we'd have a look at this charming if discreet beauty, which is Cymbidium maguanense, as you can see there. Now you can also see, perhaps there it says synonym, i.e. it's also known as, but it's not, Cymbidium mastersii. Now according to Q, Cymbidium maguanense is one species and mastersii is another one, and maguanense is from a much more specific geographic location, whereas the other one has a much wider distribution and can take warmer temperatures. The name maguanense, the maguanense refers to the place that it was discovered. So Maguan is province of Yunnan Province in southern China. So Yunnan is that part of southern China, southwest China, that borders Myanmar, Vietnam and Laos, and is a botanical hotspot. All manner of amazing plants have emerged there, perennials, shrubs, trees, orchids. So let's just generalize for a little bit, because who doesn't like a generalization? If you can grow your regular hybrid Cymbidiums, and if you can grow them well and you've got the spot that works, then you could broaden your horizons if you wanted to and start to look at species Cymbidiums, because they're a little different. The flowers are often a lot simpler, but perhaps, you know, a bit more of a challenge, or just add some interest to your collection. So if you can grow one, you'll certainly be able to grow the other, because they will like the same conditions. So this one, Cymbidium maguanense, let's have a little look. Now, as you can perhaps see, the flowers don't open fully. So that is perhaps a disadvantage. One of the reasons of hybridization is that you can improve upon all of these aspects of a plant to make the flower bigger and more open or more fragrant or a different color, increase or decrease the size of the plant, etc., etc. So the ones that you find in the wild, you know, can often have some simpler quirks, let's say. And this one has quite a light, sharp fragrance. It's not unattractive, but it's quite specific, and it's not perhaps a fragrance you would embrace with all your heart, but it is nonetheless, I think, quite light and quite beautiful. So firstly, this baby is fragrant. Now, it comes from this particular part of China on the border basically with Vietnam. And I was just curious to look at the climate there. So I did a little Googling, and the average temperatures, summer and winter, are not dissimilar to ours here in Melbourne. It can get to below freezing, so below 0 degrees centigrade, 32 Fahrenheit. Not often, but it generally hovers around 5-ish degrees centigrade as a winter minimum, which is about, I think, 42 Fahrenheit. So cold, but not freezing. However, the major difference is the humidity. So the area where this grows has an average humidity hovering in the 80s and above, whereas here in Melbourne, we're 50 to 60%. So there is quite a bit of difference from a humidity perspective. Otherwise, the growing conditions are fairly similar. The area, though, where this is grown is described as subtropical, which would be, say, Sydney here in Australia as a comparison, whereas in Melbourne we're further south and we would be described as warm temperate or a wet Mediterranean climate. We don't have the same zonal systems as you do in the States. However, it has bloomed for me and it has thrived for me, so I think it's okay. Now, this plant in its native habitat is an epiphyte, which is fine. So we all know lots of orchids are epiphytes, and that means generally that they're going to dry relatively quickly before the water's replenished because they're in the nooks and crannies of trees and branches. Some epiphytes cling and they really drain quickly. Other epiphytes are sort of more in bowls and nooks of branches or near the roots of a tree where they've gathered moss and leaf detritus, etc. So there is a bit of a difference, and this one is one that grows slightly more in nooks than clings. So the flowers are white and there's a little sort of yellow dollop to the lip in there. It's a very elegant flower, very delicate. But the interesting thing about this Cymbidium is its flowering habit. Now, it is late winter and that's when it should bloom. That's perfectly normal. And most of the hybrid Cymbidiums that you buy from a hardware store, etc., will flower sort of late winter, early spring, depending on your relative climate as to how early they are, but generally the same time of year. And that flowering is triggered by the change in season, so from autumn into winter. So Cymbidiums, hybrid Cymbidiums certainly need that temperature change from day and night, from autumn to winter, and their species ancestors need the same conditions. Ergo, if you can grow one, you'll be able to grow the other. But this one is quite different in that your hybrid Cymbidium flowers in a slightly different cycle. It just so happens I've got a hybrid over here. Let me show you. So this is a no ID hybrid pendulous type of orchid. There you go. The flowers are just on the way out, unfortunately. But what I wanted to show you was how it blooms. So with a hybrid Cymbidium, you get a new bulb which starts to grow in spring, and that then spends that whole year maturing if you feed it and water it correctly, and becomes quite fat. And then it is that bulb that is triggered by the change in seasonal weather to produce your flower spike in midwinter, late winter, early spring. Depends again on your exact climate, but that's what happens. So you will not get a flower spike from older bulbs. Like sort of Oncidium orchids, the Cymbidium will just bloom from new growths. It won't flower from old growths. And so the name of the game with hybrid Cymbidiums is, of course, new growth. The more growths you get, the more opportunity you'll get for flower spikes. So that's how this baby rolls. Our species friend does something a little different. Now, I'll come in and show you closely, but this plant has a slightly different growing habit. So instead of producing new growths and new pseudobulbs every year, as the hybrid Cymbidiums do, it essentially has a continual growth pattern from a central stem. So a lot like, say, Vandas or Sarcochilas orchids here in Australia, which is a little different. Now, it does produce new I guess pseudobulbs at the base, so it does produce new stems which start to grow, but it is that stem that once it begins to mature will produce your flower spikes. But the interesting thing is the flower spike comes out from the leaf axis as the stem is growing, but it can then multiply bloom from this same stem as the plant matures. A very different flowering cycle. So this is the older stem here, the older sort of pseudobulb, which is growing more and more leaves and getting taller and taller. And it flowered for me last year, and this year it has flowered again. And so the spike comes out from those leaves in the middle, a lot like a Vanda bloom would come out, sort of a similar position. And as the plant grows and you get more growths coming out from the bottom, once they mature, you will obviously get the opportunity for more blooms. And I'm not sure, because I've only had my plant 2 years and it's bloomed twice for me, I'm not sure whether you can get multiple spikes from this, from the central stem that you've got here. I would be very interested to know if anyone else grows this and if they do get multiple spikes. The thing is, though, perhaps you don't grow this because it was only sort of named in, I think, 1996. So it's comparatively new in terms of the Cymbidium world, which is a very ancient one because Confucius was talking about Cymbidiums 2,500 years ago, which is quite incredible. And one of the names Confucius called these was King of Fragrance, which is true. They certainly are very, very fragrant. So in Chinese horticulture for millennia, Cymbidiums weren't particularly hybridized that much. It was the species that were grown. And it's only really in the last sort of few hundred years that the hybridization has gone mad with all the incredible colors and forms that you can get now. But I like growing species orchids. I think they are, often the flowers are a lot simpler and a lot smaller and can sometimes be a bit more of a challenge because one of the benefits of hybridizing orchids is that you can sort of select some of the easier traits. So plants that are more disease tolerant, plants that are heat tolerant or cool tolerant, or whichever characteristic you want to perpetuate. So species can often be a little tricky because they've evolved to fit often a very specific ecological niche. However, this one likes the same conditions as its hybrid cousins and is doing quite well. So basic care wise, basically the same as your Cymbidiums, your hybrid Cymbidiums. It is in dappled light, so where I grow it, and I'll link my grow space video because you can see exactly where it is. It is protected from the rain, but it does sometimes get rain blown onto it. But it doesn't get rained on directly, which means I can control the moisture, because in winter you do want to dial it down a little bit, not to keep the roots moist and soggy and cold, because that can spell death for lots of orchids. And then in summer, as the season warms up, you just increase the watering. And as I said, this orchid does come from an area with much higher average humidity than me. So it's sort of nestled in amongst dappled light, and it is a little easier for me to keep that a little bit more ambiently humid than perhaps if it was further out in the garden. So it seems to love that spot. It's under the shade of some dappled silver birch trees. Obviously in winter they drop their leaves, so it does get a bit more filtered light, which is not a bad thing. And then in summer, more shade, which is also not a bad thing because direct sun will really damage the leaves. And then food-wise, the same as the hybrid Cymbidiums. I give them a topical dose of slow-release fertilizer in spring, and then throughout the growing season, I will give them liquid fertilizer, and that's usually dialed down to sort of 1/6, 1/8 of the recommended dose. And I will also alternate that with a tonic, and that can be a seaweed-based tonic or worm juice, and that's the runoff from your worm farm. You usually get a little tap and you collect the liquid, you dilute that to sort of to a 1:10 ratio, and it's not a food, it's a tonic, but full of amazing biological benefit for your plants. And I've also made a video about Cymbidiums and companion planting. So what other orchids could you grow? So if you can grow hybrid Cymbidiums, then you could certainly grow the species Cymbidiums that come from the same part of the world. And you can certainly grow then other things with them. So for example, here in Melbourne, Coelogenes from the Himalayas, those cooler climates, Coelogenes do very well in the same kind of conditions. And a lot of people in Melbourne grow Zygopetalums in the same spot. I have had no luck whatsoever with Zygopetalums, but anyway, that is a work in progress. Watch this space. I'm desperate to get one to flower. Now, I've also made a video about the species Cymbidium erythrostolum, which I will link, and that has really beautiful, kind of sad basset hand looking flowers, but they are enormous and absolutely beautiful. Now, for some reason, mine chose not to bloom this year, and it's usually a late autumn, early winter flowerer. And I was a little disheartened by that, but I was at a very specialized Orchid Society meeting, and there's a very, very experienced grower who said that he had experienced the same thing with his this year. The weather has been, as it is all around the world, really out of whack. So we had a very early cold autumn, and I'm just not sure if my erythrostolum kind of knows which way it's going at the moment. Anyway, it's sending up new growth, but it just didn't flower this year. So who knows, it might flower late, it might flower early, it might not flower at all. But I will link the video I made last year when it was in bloom to show you another species Cymbidium and how relatively easy they are and how they can just sort of change up your Cymbidium collection if that's what you're focusing on. I'm just trying to think what the fragrance is. It's a bit tuberosy actually. It's quite sharp, but in a floral way. That is not a very good description. But anyway, plant lovers from Cymbidium maguanense and myself, did I say that right? Maguanense, yes. We'll look forward to seeing you next week. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope your orchids are blooming and thriving wherever you are. Do hit subscribe so you can find out what my terrible tale might be next week. There's lots of things coming into bud and starting to get their gear on as the weather, I think, is starting to turn for the better. So who knows what next week's adventure will be, but you will if you hit subscribe. So do that, and I look forward to seeing you next week.